Let there be a tally of all the 210 constituencies. Mr. Chairman, when you were announcing for the first part of this press briefing, where ODM had won, we did not hear anybody complaining. Where President Kibaki has won, the people are echoing. This election will be won by the ballot, not by mere shouting. Mr. Chairman, we are submitting, proceed and announce the winner of the election and let us be able to move on.
Those were her moments defending quite vehemently President Kibaki's election win at KICC in 2007. After those moments, she then went ahead to stand by his side through the Serena talks, which were mediated, a mediation process that was led by Kofi Annan. Tonight, Martha Karua is in studio. She's a former presidential candidate and just from the concluded election was a gubernatorial candidate for the Kirinyaga gubernatorial race. She, of course, is also the NARC Kenya leader and joins us tonight with a message to President Kenyatta and Raila Odinga, the NASA candidate. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming in. When you look back at that clip that we've just played and those very heated moments that led you to the defense of President Kibaki and later into negotiation, do you feel where we are now echoes a similar sentiment and vibe? Is the air the same to you?
Yes and no, because at KICC, I was Kibaki's agent. And the other party had not an agent, but agents. And every candidate is entitled to an agent. I wasn't defending him. He was not on trial. I was merely looking after his interest, my interest, because I was in the PNU camp.
Right.
To ensure that the electoral body had space to conduct its work, to announce the vote. And after announcing of the vote, it's up to the individuals. Whoever is aggrieved goes to court. Like I've gone to court now, you see? So that was just to say none of the contestants can be a referee in a match they're participating in. And that's common sense.
Right. And so in this current context, what similarities or differences do you draw?
I think, what shall I say, because we are talking of a period when the results of the elections have already been declared. An aggrieved party has gone to court. The court has overturned the verdict of the electoral body and has sent the parties back to the drawing board. What it means, when a court cancels the elections and it's said clearly, it's because of irregularities and illegalities. So there is a case for the electoral body and the parties to get together to find out how to avoid the same irregularities and illegalities. So to begin with, before the replay, the rematch, the electoral body, together with stakeholders, has to sit down and see what to do to avert that situation. And I've seen them try to do that, except that they met each of the parties separately, not in one sitting. Yeah.
Do you think it was equally a significant issue that President Kenyatta did not personally present himself to IBC talks as Raila Odinga did as presidential candidate?
There's a way you could also send representation and people sit down and talk. But what I saw is one party going in their own time, the other party going in their own time. So they never had a sit down, sort of, to go through the motions and agree how to make this process better. And I think now where things are, it's not about the president or about his main protagonist, Raila Odinga. Where it has reached now is about each and every Kenyan. And I think whatever dialogue there could be ought to be all inclusive. We have a structural problem about elections. And you can see a bit of that in the 207 thing. Mm-hmm. It's all about trust. We don't trust each other. We don't trust the institutions. So how can we fix that? If we can't, because you can't sort of force people to trust. It's something you have to build over time. Therefore, how do we police each other? How do we monitor each other during this period so that we know the elections are free and fair? And normally that is the sort of dialogue people can have.
And I want to return a little later to what you believe are the substantive issues that need to be discussed at dialogue. But let me start it off with this. Should the dialogue include whether or not we can have an election on October 26th in the existing political climate or with the existing laws?
I think everything is on the table. And where there is will, there is way. To begin with, just a conversation by the two leaders would serve to bring tension down. You see, it would have its own magic. It may not cure the loss. But when there is a problem, people have to sit down and sort it out. Nobody else will sort that mess for us. And I think that we now have an opportunity where we can look at what is the matter with the way we conduct our elections. How can we make it better? How can we ensure that now henceforth we shall have clean elections? This cannot be done by one side. And that's why NARC Kenya is a party submitted before the parliamentary committee that what they were amending were laws that they made in a bipartisan committee before the elections. It follows the logic that if you wish to reopen that, then you sit down again in a bipartisan manner and fertilized by the participation of Kenyans from all walks of life. You may argue Kenyans participated when the parliamentary committee called for views, but the committee was certainly not bipartisan.
Right.
I think we just have to remember that we all are entitled to participate in the processes that are before us. So even when we disagree, we have to leave a little room where we can talk to each other. This is our country. If we don't talk to each other, then we are pushing ourselves to the brink.
You've talked about, you've twice mentioned the electoral system in which we operate. What and I suppose that would include, you know, the actual processes to the election, whether they are free and fair, and what NASA is talking about in terms of irreducible minimums. What else do you believe should be on the table right now?
I won't prescribe what should or shouldn't be on the table, but there are things that definitely need to be set right. That's why you have seen the IBC in an advert saying the things they have done, attempting to say the things they will do differently on October 26th, meaning there is agreement, the court said it, things went wrong. IBC is now sort of conceding, yes, we can reorganize this and that, but can they reorganize unilaterally without other stakeholders around them?
IBC would probably say, but we've already tried. We've reached out to either side. We called Jubilee. They were here for 30 minutes, said, or was it 15? Said there was no problem and walked out. We talked to NASA. Their list of demands, we've met most of them. The rest are unreasonable.
I think that when something monumental, like the nullification of a presidential election occurs, something previously unimaginable, I never imagined it myself.
Right.
So something unimaginable, then we must take bold steps to ensure that that sort of a thing doesn't happen again, that we do it right, because actually you put the country into an unstable situation. So it is not something IEBC or any of the parties should take lightly. We can't be going through that type of cycle. We need clean elections. Countries have been able to clean their electoral systems to the extent that election petitions are virtually unheard of. That's where we really must be going. And it's not about systems, it's about people. The IEBC as a body hires people to oversee those elections. And there are people who are perennially hired. I'm of the view that we have enough educated people in this country that once you are hired to either be a clerk, a returning officer, or a presiding officer once, it should be a once-in-a-lifetime engagement.
Right.
It doesn't take rocket science. They are trained, very few hours of training. Train new people every time to avoid people compromising and rent-seeking, where people think now they know the system, because we also know we have a problem of pervasive corruption. Let us also make it very costly for anybody who deliberately violates the rules. Let them go to jail. And I saw Parliament attempting to do that, which is commendable. The only thing, the matter with it, is that it was one side doing it. It was not bipartisan. Yeah.
All right. And since you're talking about people, Ezra Chiloba, the CEO, should he go?
I don't know. If I were him, because somebody has to take responsibility. He was in charge of the elections, and the court has nullified not just any election, but the presidential election. One could even say, I'm taking leave until the next season.
Right.
You see, a country is bigger than any one person.
So by and large, what I hear you saying is the sort of talks that you're talking about that should happen right now would be talks largely about process, how to run this October.
To instill confidence. Because remember, when the court said there will be elections, there were 60 days. But you know, we wait till the last moment. We are now talking when it is 9 days to the event, you see? But it's never late. Where there is will, there is way. People can sit down and see what adjustments need to be made. But the process needs to be credible and to be seen to be credible, not just by the participants, but also by the electorate. Remember, each one of the main candidates has lots, millions of supporters. So you don't take them along. You're alienating not one person, but their supporters. Today, if I'm seen to be saying anything that is not favorable to the president, I'll be offending the millions of his supporters. On the other hand, if what I say is not seen to be favorable to Raila Odinga, I'll be alienating millions of his supporters. So we have to remember that we want to carry the nation and as one nation. And our constitution talks of our participation. It talks of a conducive atmosphere, elections in an atmosphere devoid of intimidation, devoid of violence. We need to come together. The law is very clear that there has to be, for a presidential election, there has to be elections in all the 290 constituencies. We can reason together and we can make it happen without any acrimony, without much acrimony, without violence, without threats, and in a process which can be easily monitored so that by all the participants, so that, in other words, a transparent system where a majority of Kenyans and all people of goodwill will say, yes, we tried, we didn't make it, but the election was fair.
Two things. One being, you know, when you talk about, I'm just thinking about getting people to talk and our parties to talk on a process. When you have one party that is saying, look, we have no problem with IEBC, let them bring whoever they want, do it however they want, to Kutane kwa debe. That's Jubilee very confident in that respect.
Yeah.
And so they do not see why they need to talk. They say, go ahead, you talk with NASA because they're the ones with the problem. How do you resolve such an issue?
It's all well to say that, but let me imagine that NASA and IEBC go and reorganize things that can be reorganized without the law, you can almost bet 100% that Jubilee will now say, IBC has locked up itself with NASA. What were they talking about? What is this they have adjusted? What is cooking? There is need for this to be done with all the parties and with other stakeholders, because like I'm saying, it's not just about Jubilee and NASA. It's about Kenyans.
Right.
We should have civil society. We should have the religious leaders. Everybody can't be there, but there should be a representation of other people, other groups, main groups, other than the two protagonists. I hear now voices of the Federation of Kenya Employers. We've heard the workers. We've heard various voices saying, talk. Because they can feel the tension in the country.
Right.
It's not good.
Is the talking, though, only about the process? And whereas I understand that, I mean, process is what would be king right now, heading into an election in 9 days, there is the feeling that the contention that we see in the country is about more than this election. It's about more than this process. And the question as to whether a free, fair, credible poll that meets the highest possible standard in law would still be able to address the underlying tension that appears to be rearing its head again. What's your opinion?
I think that tension has been fueled by the refusal to sit down and thrash these things out. I imagine if this had started a week after the court ruling, the atmosphere would have been totally different. We've had talks before. I remember in 1997, the country was experiencing a lot of tension, and civil societies and opposition parties were locked in ufungamano, trying to force the government through demonstrations to accept legal reforms and constitutional reforms. And eventually, as members of parliament, we got together and started inter-party talks, which we were calling Inter-Party Parliamentary Group, IPPG.
Right.
And out of it came constitutional and legal reforms that expanded the democratic space, brought down the tension, and we went to the 1997 elections. We still cried foul and said we had been rigged by the KANU government, but at least we had space to operate. We could campaign. And I believe it is those IPPG reforms that enabled the opposition then, in 2002, enabled Mwai Kibaki to dislodge KANU. Because we now could campaign in any part of the country without the requirement of licenses. We could get airtime on TV and radio. Talks are not just useless. And after those elections of 1997, in 98, we started the IPPC, Inter-Party Parliamentary Committee, to discuss on how a legal framework for constitutional review. And that is when the formal search for a new constitution began. And there have been many other times after the 2007 elections, circumstances forced us to sit down at the table and negotiate. It ended up in a coalition government. Not all negotiations previously had ended there, but I'm just demonstrating that it is possible to talk.
And to get something, and it sounds like you're also advocating for something similar to an IPPG style now, but be that as it may, the Kenyans must be wondering what can be possibly achieved in 9 days.
We got ourselves late, we got ourselves to blame. Let us get down to work and let us see what is possible and what is not possible.
Right.
But what is important is that having elections amidst the sort of tension that is here means that the elections will be rejected by a section. It means we are just compounding the problems that we have. We'd all like to settle down and get back to our lives. We were hoping that, you remember initially the presidential repeat was going to be on the 17th. It would have been a quick fix and we go back to our work. So it is, I think it would be prudent to see what is possible, to let leaders get together and see what is possible. And I'm telling Parliament, there are 3 arms of government. Parliament is not an extension of the executive to just merely be repeating what the executive says. Parliament should take up its role. When we started IPPG, I don't think our colleagues from KANU had permission from President Moi. They went to report back, and that's when they got mandate. We had not consulted the leadership of our parties. Parliament ought to function, and people ought not fear to voice their opinion, because then you are not being helpful. Any person who fears to speak their thoughts, then it's not worth the leadership position they hold.
All right. Yeah. We're already seeing opposition leaders, saying that there will definitely not be an election in the electoral area that they represent. Some going as far as warning of some unspecified consequences on those who show up to vote on that day. So even if IEBC does this election in full conformity with the law, there's already the question as to whether it will be representative and whether the political environment is conducive for the same. What would you say then would be the preliminary thing that either side has to do to create an environment for talking in the first place?
I think once people agree to talk, the grandstanding has to end. And each side has to tell its brigades that give dialogue a chance. Because you can't talk when you're threatening each other. And talking of the IEBC, I saw them advertising that their presiding officers can open ballot boxes to remove material that they put, that did not need to be put there. That is clearly against the Election Act. They cannot amend the law by a circular. Some of us who are in court complaining about irregularities that include unauthorized opening of sealed ballot boxes. So the IEBC is giving an impression that they are telling us that they are going to follow the law, yet they are not following. That advertisement took me aback. Yeah.
Must protests also be called off for talks to take place?
I think every side has to come, its supporters, and if today the president and Raila were to agree to talk, then the grandstanding by both sides should end. And both should create an atmosphere. I remember when we started the National Accord talks in 2007, one of the conditions that we set was that there should be a cessation of violence. There were other conditions also on the side of the government, which the government of the day had to agree to, so as to make the then opposition comfortable. That is what dialogue is about, that each party addresses the concerns of the other. Yeah.
And we do not know for certain whether or not the president and Raila have exchanged a phone call, met. We do not know for sure. But what we know is that any such meeting has not been done in the public domain. Why would you reckon that talks seemingly have not happened at all one-to-one? Because you were very close to President Kibaki at the time, and so in 2007, so going into the 2008 talks, what is your insider knowledge of the considerations that presidential candidates have at such a time, and what makes them not too eager to reach out?
I think on that one, there was a lot of, you remember it all happened very, very quickly. Not like this protracted grandstanding. Right. And during that period, we had lots of visitors, former presidents, Nobel laureates like Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu, and many, many other neighboring leaders. And there was the then chairman of African Union, the then president of Ghana, Kufuor, who came. And I think all of them were talking about the need to talk. And the talks were born out of, I believe, not just President Kibaki's own thinking, but the play of the many friends, leaders saying, let's talk. But the decision that the talks should take place was the president's. The buck stops with the president. And on the side of the opposition, I am sure that the decision to talk was made by Raila in consultation with his team. A president consults his team, but the decision is his.
Right.
So I would say the buck stops with the two leaders.
Let's talk a little bit about President Kenyatta and maybe some of the considerations that could be there, if we would imagine. From what we've heard in the public domain, is, there will be no nusumkate. There's some people who are accustomed to getting power through the back door, and that there seems to be the general feeling that any talks inadvertently lead in that direction of sharing government, of sharing power. What do you think of that?
I think that's just a refusal to talk. Like I've said, we've had talks before. IPPG, IPPC, there was nothing about power sharing. And most recently, just before the August 8th, 2017 elections, there were talks by parliamentary committee, a bipartisan committee of, then it was CORD, not NASA, and Jubilee. It didn't lead to power sharing. So I think that sometimes we clothe our refusal in different ways.
And so when Raila Odinga says that hatutaki nusumkate, the whole buffalo is ours anyway. Yes.
That's the grandstanding we are talking about. It's the same thing
you're saying. All right.
Just like Jubilee saying that they are 100% sure they're going to win. Everybody's 100% sure. We all say it, but that should not stop the two leaders reaching out.
Let me ask you this, and I think finally I would love your own opinion in terms of what, any form of coalition government does. Did it weaken Kibaki in your own opinion? Was it even a successful venture as a form of government? But before we get there, there are those who also feel strictly the election must be done within 60 days, failure to which we enter this wilderness that is ungoverned by law, etc. You were a critical part of many stages of the formulation of the current law, including at some point you were Justice Minister. I mean, you've interacted with this document quite a great deal. Is that your own understanding that if we fail to hold this election, past these 60 days, then we are in the wild, wild west?
We are in a catch-22 situation. If we don't hold it within 60 days, we will even have breached the terms of the court order. You can go back to court and try to negotiate. But also, if we hold it in an unsuitable climate and we end up not holding it in the 290 constituencies, we'll still have broken the law, the constitution. We are in uncharted waters, and those are the things people should sit down and say, here we are. What is it that we can do within this time? If we find there are difficulties of doing the things that we must do to ring-fence the fundamentals of a free and fair election, what then can we do? Those are the things, yes. Would going to court to resolve this within the law, going back to court and saying, look, this is what you've said, the catch-22 situation we're in, would that yield some sort of solution? Let it be to the judges to decide whether or not the Republic can follow through with the order within the time that is left? I think it's more of a political crisis and a political decision more than a legal decision, because you first must identify what is it that you want to do. Then look at what is possible and agree on what to do. Mind you, when we negotiated the National Accord in 2007, the law didn't provide for a coalition government. I had to table a constitutional amendment to open up and make those provisions. We had to make laws. We had to make that accord part of our laws. we had to do several other things. When we had the IPPG, we had to open up the Constitution and the laws. Laws, we forget that the laws are made for us and not the other way around. It is not an everyday thing where one would boldly suggest that. But if out of the sit down, we were to see that there are practical difficulties, and therefore we need to open up, then so be it if it's necessary. But it is not a decision of one person. It is not a decision to take lightly. It's a decision you take and you sit down and do what is in the best interests of the country and what serves the larger population, not a person, not two people, not the political elite, but what serves the nation.
And a lot of people would possibly say that, you know, the everyday Kenyans, we kind of feel we've been hijacked by the political class. They are refusing to talk. We may want to talk, they don't want to talk. I mean, what are Kenyans to do? What can they possibly do if their leaders refuse to talk? Is there a way to, I suppose, recapture the discourse and the process as everyday Kenyans, devoid of whether, you know, Jubilee and NASA want to sit down and talk?
Yes, by making their voices heard. I'm actually delighted today to hear the Federation of Kenya Employers. Those are Kenyans talking. I was delighted to hear KOTU. I'm delighted to hear divergent voices coming up and giving solutions. And I am sure that as more Kenyans come out, the leaders represent people, they don't represent themselves. They will listen. I do remember in 2001, when KANU went to their national conference in Kasarani, they were shouting at the top of their voices that the constitution was not going to be changed. But President Moi had gauged the mood in the country. And to save the country from disintegration, he raised his voice and told the delegates conference that they were going to amend the constitution to allow multipartyism. So in moments of crisis, you actually get to know leaders during moments of crisis.
Right.
Because that is when leadership is needed. That is when the true leader will tell the followers that the direction you are pushing is wrong, and for this reason, I suggest we do this, and explain. Inspire them to a different course. That's what I'm saying. Therefore, the two main protagonists, the President Uhuru and Raila Odinga, owe a responsibility to this nation to offer critical leadership at this time.
Just before I get your final word to them, I had alluded to a question earlier. The Grand Coalition government, in hindsight, did it, sorry, reminiscing, do you think it weakened President Kibaki significantly, and in so doing created the perception that power can be negotiated, whereas we work in a democracy where that negotiation should be happening at the ballot? And do you think that coalition government worked?
Yes, it worked. We have the 2010 Constitution because of that Grand Coalition government. But in other ways, it did not work. And yes, it did weaken the presidency because President Kibaki had to consult with the Prime Minister in making certain critical decisions. But in a way, it taught us that power is a shared space. You cannot hug all the power to yourself. And that is now what our Constitution says. So if we are to learn from our immediate history, power sharing, not necessarily in a coalition government, but through participation, through negotiations, through cooperation. And this is what even the two levels of government should do. It actually is a form of strength, not a weakness. But we are so used to strong men and strong women that we think hugging power to yourself is what is strength. It is not.
Your final words to the President and the NASA presidential candidate.
Is that you owe a responsibility to us as citizens to ensure that this country stays together, to ensure that we maintain peace, and therefore we are urging you to talk to one another and to offer leadership at this very critical moment.
Thank you so much for your views this evening. Let's take a look at what you've had to say about our conversation tonight. The kind of dialogue Martha Karua is proposing has been done by IEBC Kenya. All parties have agreed except NASA. What would be the agenda? Very quickly, Martha. Would you have a response to that?
I already said that they never sat down together. I saw them each go to the IEBC different times. They need to come together, thrash those issues together.
I concur the two principals must talk and show leadership. Monday Special KE, in any conflict, even the slightest, it's only talks and prayers that can help out if we stop talking center stage. Peace needed. Martha Karua is a sober mind, tribeless Kenyan leader indeed. Abarikiwe. Ubarikiwe, Martha.
Asante.
Sober and vivid discussion indeed. That's the only way to overcome this impasse. And I think that's about what we have. That's on Twitter. Let's take a look at Facebook. Thanks for writing in to us tonight. Martha Karua speaks for us independent-minded Kenyans who are not yet drowned by the tribal tides. Dialogue is the only way we can solve our country's problem at the moment. Very few leaders come along that think like Martha. A final one here. NASA's victory was stolen. We need it back in full.
That can only be through the
No, that's the whole Bothlo thing I was talking about.
Yeah.
When we thank you for your views, whatever they are, we certainly do appreciate it. I am Ann Kiguta. Have a wonderful evening. God bless you. God bless Kenya. And good night.
Thank you
Thank you very much.